good evening. My name is Dick Clay. I'm the president and the CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Welcome and thank you all for joining us live and in person, and also virtually for tonight's event. Our mission is the same as it has been since our founding in 1884, and that is to collect, preserve, and share the history of Kentucky, the Ohio River Valley, Slovakia, and Ukraine. Now it gives me immense pleasure to turn the program over to Sandy Wilson, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Sandy has served the Filson with distinction for 15 years, including serving as board chair from 2007 to 2010, and then as chair of the extraordinarily successful capital campaign for this remarkable American Institute of Architects award-winning building, the Owsley Brown II History Center. Sandy?
Well, welcome everybody. It's great to be here in person. This may be the first or second in-person gathering that Filson's had in quite a long time, and it's just wonderful to be here. And we also have people on Zoom, so welcome to all of them as well who are tuning in from elsewhere. We're all looking forward to this evening's conversation with Ambassador Tod Sedgwick, but first let me share a little bit of his background. He served from 2010 to 2015 under President Obama as the American ambassador in Bratislava, the capital of the Slovak Republic. Those were particularly important years in that part of Eastern Europe, as we will learn later. He remains closely connected to the foreign policy world and serves on the boards of Foreign Policy for America and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. In addition, he's affiliated with the Atlantic Council and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ambassador Sedgwick is also a successful businessman and entrepreneur. In the 1970s, he founded Pasha Publications, a specialty publisher focused on energy, defense, and the environment. And from 1987 to 2010, he was the CEO of Sedgwick Publishing Company. During that time, he was also the CEO of Red Hills Lumber Company and a director of the Sedgwick Land Company. In 2001, he founded IO Energy, an online energy information company covering the natural gas, coal, and electricity industries, and served as IO's chairman from 2001 to 2004. He is also an honors graduate of Harvard College, where he concentrated on history, more specifically the history of the Ottoman Empire, which is especially relevant since for centuries the expansionist Ottoman Turks had a significant impact on Eastern and Central Europe. At the end of our conversation this evening, there should be plenty of time for questions. So think of questions that you would like Ambassador Sedgwick to address. Without further ado, let me ask everybody to join me in welcoming Ambassador Tod Sedgwick to the Filson. Welcome. At the very outset, will you share with us how Louisville and some nonprofit organizations are addressing the current crisis in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe?
Well, thank you, Sandy. Let me say thank you to you and Dick, because I can't think of any more appropriate place to talk about this conflict than the Filson History Center, because so much, we in the United States are not burdened by our history as much as they are in Russia, the Balkans, Eastern Europe. The more we understand the history of that region, the more we can understand what's going on and why. But it's a great question about Louisville. I think it's an extraordinary phenomenon that Louisville, like Slovakia, playing an outsized role, punching way above its weight and supporting among the NATO countries and supporting Ukraine. So is Louisville playing an outsized role in supporting Ukrainians. It's quite extraordinary. You have, Kevin, are you here? Kevin Lynch? There you are. Kevin Lynch is representing the mayor's office. He has a task force on Ukraine and the number of nonprofits I'd like to recognize. So if any of you want to get involved in helping Ukraine, all these nonprofits have been remarkably active. Denise Sears is here, President and CEO of SOS International. Denise, can you stand up? And Mark Hogg is out here with water stuff, but they're providing filtered water over there, very significant. And Dale Olker, Dale, are you here? There he is. Dale, thank you for coming. He's executive director of Love the Hungry. They're providing food supplies in those areas just outside of Kyiv that have been where people don't have any food. They're starving. And Dr. Gordon Tobin, I don't know if he's here or not, but he's been also extremely active. And for example, SOS airship over 400,000 items of medical supplies to Ukraine that have already been delivered. And then the second shipment of pharmaceuticals, and more shipments are coming. So God bless all of you who are helping the cause. In any case, yeah.
Thanks. That's really remarkable. I'm so glad you had an opportunity to share that with us, because many of us are probably not aware of how much Louisville has been involved.
No, it's really remarkable.
Yeah. Getting to the history of this very interesting region, the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc fell apart between 1989 and 1991. And amazingly, 16 new countries were created out of the former Soviet Union and out of countries in Eastern Europe, and Slovakia was one of those. You were ambassador there from 2010 to 2015. Can you share some of Slovakia's history, strategic position, politics, its alliances, and where it is today? And we've got some handy maps up here, which I'm happy to stand up and point to here in case some people are geographically challenged like me. And, there's a little pointer here, and maybe I can point out Slovakia on here, right in this area in East Central Europe, and there's Bratislava, where the U.S. Embassy.
Yeah, I think the most significant thing about Slovakia is the fact that it really is a new country. So it was part of Czechoslovakia. And then before that, for 1,000 years, before World War I, it was part of Hungary. And literally 1,000 years. And my feeling is psychologically, as a result of them being a new country, they're very grateful for what they have. And they're extremely hardworking people. They don't take anything for granted. And so unlike Hungary, for example, there's a lot of grievance about the fact that they lost or were on the wrong side of 2 world wars, and have grievances about the territories they lost. Well, Slovakia is starting from nothing as a country, and a brand new country. So therefore, they're very forward looking, and their economy has been remarkably successful as an independent country in the region. And geopolitically, they're very appreciative of the relationship to the European Union. Without the European Union, these countries would be much more backward than they are now. And they've benefited from the European Union, and they've benefited from their relationship with the United States through NATO and many other ways.
When you were there, did you sense any tension within Slovakia between maybe some Slovaks who felt a little bit pulled towards Russia because of their connection to the former Soviet Union, and other Slovaks who were much more oriented towards the West, towards Europe, and really leaning in that direction? Did you encounter any of that sort of tension?
You know, dealing with the Russians was a big part of my job. You know, I asked the mission. We have, as the United States does everywhere in the world, we have probably by far the largest embassy. We had over 100 people. And I asked, well, what's the second largest? And the second largest is Russia. They have 60 people. And I said, well, what are all those people doing? And they said, well, basically they're spies. And in fact, the ambassador, the Russian ambassador himself was a KGB guy. So, and that's gives you an insight into the country. It's a country that's paranoid, very suspicious of outsiders, very paranoid about the West. And there were many, we'll get into this later in the conversation, but there were many efforts in NATO to work with the Russians, and they ended up always simply being spies in Brussels and suspicious and paranoid about what our intentions were. But yeah, I mean, in 2014, when I was there and the Russians invaded Donbass, they had 50 anonymous websites that looked like news articles or news publications. They were very professionally done. They were all Russian fabrications. And, you know, we did a lot. So we were doing a lot in trying to battle this kind of disinformation campaign. And, you know, the problem is there are a couple of reasons why the Russians are popular among some of the population. One is that, you know, the capitalist system has left some of the population behind, particularly the eastern part of the country, which has a higher unemployment and is closer to Ukraine, close to Russia. And, you know, there's a large unemployment there. And whereas the western part of the country, Bratislava, is very prosperous, very pro-West. And then the other factor is that and this, I remember meeting with the prime minister, and I was complaining about what their relationship to Russia. He would go to Moscow, and I said, well, he said, well, you know, you got to realize that the Russians liberated this country from the Nazis. And so there's a lot of gratitude, understandably, for their role. They lost an enormous number of soldiers, the Russians did, back in the end of the World War II. So there's, as I say, you know, they remember these things like it was yesterday. And so that's what we were dealing with.
That's so interesting. So when you were in Bratislava, you really had a ringside seat to what was going on next door in Ukraine in those very critical years between 2010, 2014. Can you share with us a little bit of what happened in Ukraine in 2014, which was really sort of the culmination of several years of movement politically there, and how that affected you as the U.S. ambassador in a neighboring country in Slovakia? Did that change your mission, for example, or change your focus?
Yeah, we had a lot of, I mean, what was going on in Ukraine at that time was that there was a Prime Minister, Yanukovych, who was dealing with the EU was trying to negotiate an aid pact, or not an aid pact, but a trade pact with the EU. The idea was that that would be a precursor to ultimate membership in the European Union for Ukraine. And then, and so he was very far down the road in implementing that or signing it. And then Putin came along and said, well, I've got a better deal for you. I'd like you to be part of my trade little corridor here around Russia. And he was basically bribed to go in that direction. And then the country went nuts. I mean, that was when you had those demonstrations in the Maidan, because they wanted to be, which is the main square in Kyiv. And they really wanted to be part of the West. And so Yanukovych then had to flee, and then Poroshenko succeeded him, and then Zelensky succeeded Poroshenko. So, and then the way it affected my mission, it was interesting. Same kind of issues. We had our prime minister, who, as I say, was kind of, he wanted to be a friend of everybody. I want to be a friend of Russia. I want to be a friend of China. I want to be a friend of the United States. And he ended up angering all of them, you know. And so he would go around the country giving speeches against the sanctions, because that was politically popular, because he was claiming it would affect their economy, which we had proof that it had minimal effect on their economy, the sanctions. And I got calls from the White House, our State Department, all the time. Hey, how are they going to vote in the European Union forum on sanctions? And I'd call the foreign minister and his cell phone, private phone, and say, you guys with us? He'd say, yeah, don't worry. He's just giving political speeches. You know, we're loyal to the European Union. It's a small country, and they don't want to be, they're grateful for being members of the EU. They don't want to be the one rogue country that's going to break the EU consensus.
So in 2014, Putin and his Russian troops invaded Crimea, Crimea had been part of Ukraine since, I think, 1954, something like that, when the Soviet government made it a part of Ukraine formally. And then he invaded eastern Ukraine, the Donbass area. What is your perspective on Putin's claims that Ukraine is culturally and historically absolutely a part of Russia?
Yeah, I think it's completely false. I mean, and this is a history center, and Putin actually wrote an essay that you're familiar with in 2021 on the Ukraine, proving that Ukraine, in his mind, that Ukraine did not exist as a country. And he would tell leaders, he's been there for 22 years, and he would tell George H.W. Bush, you know, Ukraine just simply is not a country. And but the history is very clear that Ukraine has a separate language, a separate culture, a separate food, a separate identity, and they're very I mean, and to give you a sense of the Ukrainian, you know, the public opinion, there was a referendum on independence back in, I'm going to say 1992. And 83% of the people turned out. Now that's huge percentage by any standard, certainly by American standards. And of the 83% who turned out, 92% voted for independence. So that gives you a sense that even because the image was, well, people in the eastern part of the country are more Russian oriented than the people in the West are. Not true. The people in the East, even the Russian speakers, really prize their Ukrainian identity, their Ukrainian independence. And a lot of it goes back to, this is a history center, so I'll give you just a little snapshot of some of the history, which is back in the 10th century, literally. There was the birth of Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus was a little enclave that was the origin of what's now Russia, and the origin, by the way, of the Russian Orthodox Church. And a lot of this is driven by religion, which is a whole other interesting. But the leader of Kievan Rus at that time was Vladimir the Great, and Vladimir Putin thinks he's the successor to Vladimir the Great. It's interesting that his real name is Volodymyr, which is the same as Volodymyr Zelensky. And by the way, the guy wasn't even Russian or Ukrainian. He was a Viking. You know, the Kievan Rus was settled by Vikings back in the day. So their idea of history is completely fallacious. But on the religion side, it's really interesting that they, meaning the Russians in Moscow, believe that they are the third Rome. So you had Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. Then you had the capital moving under Constantine the First in the 4th century from Rome to Constantinople. That's the second Rome. And then after the fall of Constantinople, the Russian Orthodox Church has since claimed that they're the third Rome, and so they're the protectorate of all the Orthodox. Now, happily, the Ukrainians have their own Orthodox Church that's separate from the Russians. So, but Ukraine really goes back to the rebellion of the minorities in Ukraine back in the 17th century, and then the Russians took them over, and so. But just because a country takes it over doesn't mean it belongs there forever. So.
Well, it's so interesting because it strikes me that with Putin, he's very emotional about this. I mean, I've read his essay from 2021.
He's obsessed.
Which is a very bizarre document, a rambling sort of take on his version of the history, filled with resentment. And it strikes me that his flawed memory and his nostalgia are extremely potent motivators for him. In a way, I mean, he says in the essay that Russia was robbed of Ukraine. He was furious at the Bolsheviks for having given Ukraine to their own socialist Soviet republic,
Right.
Made them a specific entity, and for giving Ukraine Crimea. So in light of that, how significant do you think the expansion of NATO was as a motivating force for Putin's actions. Do you think that's just an excuse, or do you think that really was a burr under the saddle for him?
I think it was both and. I mean, people have strong opinions about the Eastern expansion of NATO. My own feeling is that, those countries, and there's a very good book that was written recently by a Yale professor called Not One More Inch. And they go through that history, the recent history, very, blow by blow. And I think that the West should have made more of an effort to include Russia in that evolution. But this is at a time when the Russians were open to NATO expansion, but we could have done a little more. What I think that much more serious than NATO expansion, because I feel if you're a sovereign country in the Eastern Europe, of course, I've served in Slovakia, so I'm sympathetic to their points of view. That you should have the right to affiliate with whatever group you want to affiliate with, and that shouldn't be deprived. You shouldn't be deprived of that. But where I think we went too far, frankly, in my opinion, is we offered back in 2007. We offered a path for membership in NATO to, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And I think the mistake there was, number one, we really didn't do it. NATO had no intention of taking any of those countries to begin with. So I think it was poking the bear too much. I think we could have, he would have been happy with NATO going all the way to Ukraine, but to start talking about Ukraine right on their borders being part of NATO, which now I think personally, Ukraine should have a right to be part of NATO, but we have to be realistic. And in my opinion, that's what played a large role in provoking the current conflict. That and the fact that when he talks, Victory Day was a couple days ago in Moscow, and he really talked about the motherland. Well, in Putin's mind, the motherland is Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. That's what he considers to be the motherland.
Your point about poking the bear is a very good one. Our late, great diplomat, author, historian, George Kennan wrote in 1997 that NATO expansion, he considered, was the most fateful error of American policy in the post-Cold War era. That may be too strong a statement, but your perspective on that's very interesting, that maybe starting to pull Ukraine and Moldova and Belarus into that conversation was particularly aggravating to Putin early on. So it's a
right. I think that was just going too far.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the European Union. The European Union was making overtures to those same countries, but at the same time, the European Union really had no intention of accepting them anytime soon, anyways. I mean, they're not accepting a lot of the Balkan countries already. Half the Balkan countries are not members of the European Union.
Right.
So there's a lot of enlargement fatigue in the European Union.
Kennan had a particular, well, of course, he was a very keen observer of Russia and the Soviet Union. And he wrote something which struck me as being very perceptive and really can apply probably to Putin and his cohorts today. He was writing about the Soviet leaders at the time. And he concluded that Soviet leaders had a view of history similar to that of traditional Russian leaders. Archaic in form, fragile and artificial in its psychological foundations, unable to stand comparison with political systems of Western countries. So is that really behind a lot of Putin's fears, a fear of a successful democratic Ukraine as really an existential threat, even beyond his sort of mystical feelings of mystical connection to Ukraine as being inherently a part of Russia?
No, I think there's no question, but that, having a thriving democracy hopefully in his view, not a successful democracy, next door to him would provoke, dissent in Russia, which he is doing everything he can to suppress. Russia is more suppressive now than any time in its recent history under Putin. And so he would feel that if Ukraine were to be a thriving democracy, that would really threaten his own rule.
So turning to Slovakia today, it's really a frontline state. I mean, it shares a border. Let's see if this pointer will work. It shares a border right here with Ukraine. It's taken in a lot of refugees, for example. How is Slovakia helping Ukraine? You mentioned that it's punching above its weight in the beginning of our conversation. Is it in full alignment with the NATO allies? What are your friends in Slovakia saying? And how supportive is the U.S. being to Slovakia right now?
Well, they're being extremely supportive of Ukraine, and the United States is being extremely supportive of Slovakia. Mainly, I mean, there's an article in the New York Times about the different NATO countries and what they're doing. It said that Slovakia is actually more helpful to Ukraine than any other NATO country, which is remarkable. I'm not taking anything away from the others. Even countries that are not in NATO are helping, like Sweden and Finland, although it looks like they're going to be part of NATO pretty soon because they're scared. But they're providing a battery of S-300 surface-to-air missiles in Ukraine, which is hugely, and that's an old Russian system. So the Ukrainians know how to use those, and that will be remarkably effective in Ukraine. And then we're supplying them so they can do their air policing. We're providing them with Patriots, which we need to train them, but they're very skilled at being trained. And when I was there, we were always trying to get them off of the Russian equipment and onto NATO compatible equipment. And they've been going along those lines quite well.
And didn't Slovakia also help us in Afghanistan too?
Yeah, they were right in there with NATO. A lot of people don't recognize that the Afghanistan mission was a NATO mission. It wasn't the United States, it was NATO. And the worst thing I ever had to do as ambassador was go to funerals of Slovak soldiers who were killed. And the way I learned that the war was not going so well was that they were killed by friendly fire. And it was horrible. It was tragic. But interesting, I read we have, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we in the United States, the Pentagon started something called the State Partnership Program, where the new countries were linked with different states. So I'm trying to remember, Kentucky, I think, was linked with, I can't remember which country, but Indiana was linked with Slovakia. So the head of the Indiana National Guard, the adjutant general, would come, he'd be treated like a head of state. Well, I heard a really interesting podcast the other day from the head of the California National Guard, because he was linked with Ukraine. And he said, a lot of people were amazed that the Ukrainians have mounted such a stout defense of their country. He said, I was not surprised, because we trained those guys, and we trained them in the American model of having non-commissioned officers, lieutenants and so forth, make decisions on the ground based on the situation on the ground. Whereas the Russians would just direct everything from Moscow. The communications, the information they were getting, the intelligence was terrible. Our intelligence has been excellent. The Ukrainian intelligence, by the way, is exceptional. They're really skilled. And so you have the fog of war, and that's why the Russians have been running into so many problems, because people in Moscow don't really know what's happening on the ground, and that's why they couldn't get to Kiev and they were beaten back. So it's been a remarkable story, but Americans played a big role.
So interesting. We read almost every day about energy and Europe's dependence on energy coming from Russia that they're trying to wean themselves off of. What is Slovakia's situation there? How dependent are they on Russian oil and gas right now?
They're very dependent, and that was actually another big issue that I worked on when I was serving there, because I talked to the State Department and the Slovaks and said, what's going to happen when, not if, but when the Russians cut off Ukrainians from gas supply? Because the main pipeline that the Russians have into Europe goes through Ukraine, into Slovakia, and then on into the rest of Europe. And they hadn't really looked at it. And they came up with a very clever way. And then the Russians, in fact, did cut them off, as they had before. And luckily it had been a mild winter, and the Slovaks figured out a way of taking the gas. They couldn't just reverse flow it with that pipeline because it was a east to west pipeline. But they developed this little spur line to a neighboring unused pipeline, which they very quickly renovated. And so they had a loop of taking Russian gas and looping it back into Ukraine. And that was a very successful project. But the big picture is that the Slovaks, I think they're remarkably courageous in what they're doing with the S-300s and so forth, because they're extremely dependent upon the Russians for energy of all kinds. You know, most of their power comes from nuclear, and they get 100% of their nuclear fuel from the Russians, and they get all 100% of their oil from the Russians. And unfortunately, their refineries are dedicated to the kind of oil that's coming from Russia, you know, that grade of oil. And then they're 80% dependent on the Russians for gas. Now they have, I've been talking to the ambassador, they have different ways of solving all this, but it can't be done overnight. It's the same kind of thing that they're dealing with all over Europe, you know. But I mean, I think they're remarkably courageous because the Russians could just cut them off.
How do you see that playing out? Do you think they are truly committed to getting away from the dependence on Russian energy?
Yeah, I think they're moving as fast as they can, like all those countries. And it's remarkable. I mean, even Germany, which had ignored their dependence on Russian gas in recent history. I mean, they got off of nuclear, they got off of coal. They're 100% dependent on Russian gas, and this social democratic government. I mentioned that because they typically are more, want to negotiate and be friendly with the Russians. They've really taken a whole different approach in that Nord Stream 2 pipeline. They're going to stop that, and they're trying to do everything they can. They didn't even have any import terminals like Poland does, LNG import terminals. So they're building those, and they're very quickly getting off of Russian gas supply.
So interesting. Talking a little bit more about the economics of the region, I looked up Ukraine, and I was really startled to see how poorly off Ukraine is, relatively speaking. We think of Ukraine as being this huge country with enormous resources, 44 million people, the second largest country in Europe. But the gross domestic product a couple of years ago was only $131 billion. That's less than a quarter of Walmart's annual revenues. And the per capita GDP was a little over $3,100. By comparison, Slovakia has a per capita GDP, of course, many fewer people, more than 6 times as large.
Right.
So, when we see images on television of Ukraine, we see people who look reasonably well dressed, reasonably prosperous, but the country really is not considered a particularly well-to-do country. It's sort of lower middle income. And Putin, in fact, has used that as an excuse for his behavior, saying, look at Ukraine, look at all the resources, and look what an economic wreck it is. They don't even deserve to be independent, which I think is a fascinating distortion. But I was so impressed that how well Slovakia compares in terms of its economic numbers.
Yeah. Well, even Poland, if you look at Ukraine had about the same, at the time after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Poland and Ukraine had roughly the same GDP, and now Poland was 5 times Ukraine, and the problem in Ukraine, this is why they're not going to get into the EU anytime soon. The problem is that the corruption has been incredible. And so, I mean, I don't think Putin, of all people, has a right to say, well, they're corrupt, so we need to take him over. I mean, he's the most corrupt guy in the world. But they've really been hampered by the endemic corruption they've had. Every prime minister would come in, and the different parties would come in, and the parties were basically how much can we steal for our people, our party members, and the other party would come in and steal everything for them and put the other side in jail. So they have to solve these political issues, and Zelensky was the first one to come along and start dealing with corruption, and the IMF and other international organizations and the US are insisting that they clean up their act if they want to get more aid. But now it's more of a military emergency, so we are providing all this aid to them, and humanitarian aid, as we should. But yeah, long term, they're going to have, but I tell you, the reason that argument doesn't go very far with the Ukrainians is that the Russian occupied sections of Ukraine are even worse now than they were when they were in Ukraine. And the Donbass and Crimea, those people are miserable. They're not, their standard of living has declined since the Russians took them over. So I think the Ukrainians are saying, well, we don't want to go in that direction, and we'd rather fight for our country.
So as we think about the history of the region and the war that's going on, even though Putin doesn't call it a war, it's a special military operation. How do you think all this will end? Is it going to end in negotiation? Is it going to end in what some people have been talking about much more openly now, some form of victory, however that's defined? Where do you see this going, and how long do you think it's going to take to reach some sort of endpoint?
I'd be the last person to be able to predict anything. I mean, this whole thing has been unpredictable from the very beginning, right? Because I didn't think that Putin was actually going to invade. Our intelligence, US intelligence, is very good on that. They said they're going to invade, but where US intelligence failed, I think, was in understanding how bad the Russian military was and how good the Ukrainians were going to be. But I think that, ideally, Ukraine would say, and Putin would make a deal saying, okay, we'll be neutral, we're not going to go into NATO. And there has to be some territorial concession. But I will say, I just heard a presentation this morning from Ambassador Bill Taylor. He was ambassador in Ukraine twice, earlier before Masha Yovanovitch, and then later as a 7-month appointee. So he's talking to the Ukrainians all the time. And because the Ukrainians are having such great success militarily, they're not in a mood to bargain away any of their territory. They've lost so many, civilians. And so, they're not happy about the way that they're being treated by the Russians. So you can't blame them for saying, no, their mood is that we're going to fight it out. So if that's the case, then that would argue for a kind of protracted thing that could be years, certainly not weeks, but more like months and years. But people have been saying there's going to be a truce, but I'm more pessimistic.
Great. Well, thanks so much for all your
sorry to end on that sour note.
We'll see what happens, but we want to leave plenty of time for questions from everybody here. We've got 15 or 20 minutes for questions. And I think the idea would be, because we're on Zoom with cameras over there, if members of the audience have questions, there is a mic right up here, so people can kind of step up to that and ask Ambassador Sedgwick his views on whatever you'd like.
I have more questions myself than I have answers. So.
Here is Mac Brown, one of our former chairs of the board.
I'll be first. Ambassador, first of all, thank you for being here and thank you for your service. It's very important, I know. It strikes me that we're actually watching the third Russian invasion of Ukraine in so many years. And it also makes me start thinking about more global events of what's going on in Taiwan. Can you give us your thoughts of what are some of the things that either we should have done to help signal to the Russians the kind of reaction that they are now seeing, at least on the third invasion, but the kind of things that we should be doing to make sure the Chinese understand they're going to get a very serious reaction when it comes to Taiwan. And thank you.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think that what could we have done differently? You know, I mean, if we've been able to go, the problem is that Crimea geographically and logistically is very difficult to go and defend, right? I mean, and that's partly why it was never part of NATO, because we have to think about, well, what can we realistic, you know, this Article 5 is a serious element in NATO. You know, if you get invaded, then you go to their assistance. You have to make sure that you can actually do that. And so I think that, you know, they went into Crimea and we protested, but we didn't do anything militarily. And so I think that is what encouraged Putin to say, well, I think the West is weak, they're decadent, you know, and I think I can go for the whole, you know, the whole deal, the whole country. And certainly his mission was to take over Kyiv and have regime change supportive of Russia. I think they've done a magnificent job since then of bringing our allies together. I think that if I have any criticism, is we should have provided more military assistance sooner, because they're doing a great job with the military assistance that we are providing. But we need to be very careful about not poking the bear too hard, you know. And so I'm very uncomfortable when I read about the U.S. intelligence providing the intelligence they needed to kill a bunch of Russian generals. I don't think that's helpful in the whole, you know, desire for a peaceful settlement of this thing. So, but I think that what we're doing is, I think the Ukrainians are remarkable fighters. And, you know, the thing that in war, Napoleon said, the most important thing is morale. And, you know, you have these Russian soldiers who are basically conscripts. They're in for less than a year. They're hardly trained. And one thing I heard an interview with Zelensky, and he was shocked at how little Putin and the Russians think of their own people, the soldiers. They just leave them on the ground. They don't give them a proper burial. They don't do a normal thing of having a truce and you take your bodies and we'll take ours. You know, they just leave. It's just terrible. And so he's just these soldiers are just being sent there as cannon fighters, and these Ukrainians. And they didn't even know they were going in to attack another country. They thought they were on a training mission, you know. Whereas the Ukrainians, they're fighting for their country, and so their morale is exceptional.
We welcome our large virtual audience, and I have a question from one of them. Stephen Zink says, "Does Ukraine truly have the ability to prevail, and how serious is the nuclear threat?"
Well, it depends on how you define prevailing. You know, so at the end of the day, the hope would be that they'd have some kind of settlement that would give the Russians some kind of territorial concession. I think what the Russians would like to do is to take the whole, and this is something I don't think the Ukrainians would ever accept. They would like to take Odessa and control the whole southern coast. And then if the Ukrainians wanted to export any grain, they'd have to pay the Russians, you know, for getting their goods out of Ukraine. So I don't think the Ukrainians will, you know, who knows over time, but I mean, they're running out of I mean, if you have to use Syrian mercenaries to fight, they're getting down to the bottom of the barrel, it seems to me. And also the rockets that they have, the missiles that they have, they're running out of them. And we have embargoed, these electronic components needed for these missiles. So that I think they're down 80 to 20% of what they had originally. So time is not on their side. So, and that raises the other question about the nuclear threat. I mean, it's a terrible thing to contemplate. I think more likely it would be, maybe chemical, I hate to say it, but chemical and biological may come before nuclear. Hopefully none of it, but I can't speculate, They say Putin's a madman. I don't agree with the idea that he's a madman. I think he's deluded, but I don't think he's crazy. But I hope he's not crazy enough to even think about the nuclear option. And hopefully, if he did, there'd be people in his chain of command who would block it. But it's all speculation.
Ambassador Sedgwick called out the impact of the response from Louisville, Kentucky, but he humbly didn't talk about his own role in that. It would not have been possible without his leadership in connecting us with well-vetted NGO partners in Slovakia who had the capacity to deliver the supplies that were shipped across the border into Ukraine. So I want to thank you, Ambassador, for your role in that.
I want to thank my partner, Christy Brown, who's supported that first mission.
Christy very, very generously, yes, supported the first shipment. The Kentucky Medical Association supported the second, and we have a local church supporting the third, which, by the way, every shipment includes not only the medical supplies, but we are transporting the supplies from Love the Hungry and Water Steps. So it's a comprehensive response. So I do have a question also. Can you talk to, just give us your opinion on the impact of all of these sanctions? I understand they probably take time to take root and really play a role in shifting the balance. Is it for naught, or is it going to eventually have some impact that could impact the outcome?
That's a great question. It's definitely having a huge impact on the economy of the country, and it's hurting the Russian people, which is a terrible thing that the people have to suffer for a leader's misguided operation. I think the thing that will have the most significant impact will be when the Europeans are able to stop using any Russian gas and oil. When that happens, then he's going to run out of money for sure, because and a lot of these other sanctions are very effective. You have to speculate about, okay, Putin's wealth is parked with a lot of those oligarchs that he's made wealthy. I think it's like Huey Long used to be in Louisiana. He'd park money with and then when he was assassinated, all these people got rich, right? And but Putin has a lot of money, I'm assuming, nominally with all of these oligarchs. And so you would hope that when these oligarchs are getting their yachts seized and so forth, and they're getting sanctioned, that they would have an influence on him, but I think it's unlikely. I don't think I think he has more influence over them than they do over him. So I'm not optimistic about that scenario, but I think that if Europe, and they've taken too long in doing this, but if they really get serious, which they are, about not paying for any more Russian gas, which is going to take some time, that's really the sanction that's going to be most effective.
Question at this end. What is the role of Turkey currently in all of this? As it sits across the Black Sea and observes? Is it doing more? I read sometimes that it's sending really good tactical weapons over. What is its role here?
Yeah, and that's going back, Sandy, to the history, you know, the Russia and Turkey. It's been the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. I mean, this has been going on for centuries. And, you know, Catherine the Great was the one who finally emerged into the Black Sea and felt that that was a strategic imperative, which Putin has continued. Yeah, Turkey is definitely being very helpful in this whole effort. I don't know a lot of the specifics, but I think they're being extremely helpful. And, you know, they've had a problematic relationship with NATO. They're a member of NATO, but they've been playing ball with the Russians. Hopefully that will stop now.
Hi there. My question, I've been to Ukraine 3 times. I'm really rooting for them. Really not happy with Mr. Putin, but I'm also thinking about the climate. And I certainly want the Europeans to give up the Russian fossil fuels, but I'm wondering what are the odds that that will actually lower the price of those same fossil fuels if they go to India and China, meaning does China get and India get a lower price because they no longer have the competition of Europe? And will it actually escalate the combustion of more fossil fuels? Is this sort of like a shell game? Is this making any sense at all?
Well, I do think that it's going to have an adverse impact on, unfortunately, on climate change, you know, because these countries that have been totally dependent on gas are going to have to start burning coal again in order to provide electricity to their customers. So I agree that if you look at the whole picture, there's going to have to, unfortunately, there's going to have to be more fossil fuels used and not less, unfortunately.
Including in India and China, do you think?
Yeah,
That's my fear. Okay,
yeah, I'm afraid.
thank you.
Yeah, it's not a happy picture.
Thank you for your service. I have a question related to the economy in Russia with all the sanctions taking place. And I think we all recognize that the Putin and his administration control the media, but the media is limited to the fact that as time moves to the right, there is an extraordinary increase in the loss of Soviet soldiers. And that gets back to Soviet families who talk to one another. And like a disease or an infection, it starts to spread. And potentially their strategy was to get things over quickly, thinking that they could do that. But we're seeing that that's becoming a difficulty under the current circumstances. So my basic and fundamental question is, what are the thoughts that at some point in time, there could be a potential uprising of the Soviet civilization, population, if you will, that potentially could turn the tide of this battle?
Well, so you raise a really good point, which is that they're losing, the estimates are 10 to 20,000 soldiers that the Russians have lost. So let's take a midpoint, 15,000. Well, I think that that's the number that that's more than how many they lost in the entire 5 years of the Afghan war, right? I can't remember what the number was, but it's more like 10 or less. And so, and what the Russians, because of the control of the media, as you point out, what they're saying is that if someone complains about their son, they say, well, they're in a Ukrainian prisoner of war camp. And what the Ukrainians are doing is they're saying, well, they're getting the names of these Russian soldiers. They're calling their parents, and they're saying, I'm so sorry, but I want to report to you that your son is dead. And I just want you to know what your regime is doing. And we're sorry, and we'll be happy to give your son a proper burial, but you should know the truth, which is they're making these phone calls to the parents. And so will that result? I'm skeptical that there's such a lid on Because you think about, okay, if Putin is overthrown, who comes next? The people around him are even worse than he is, most of them. And so I think it's unlikely, and the repression is so profound that I think it's unlikely there will be any kind of popular rebellion. I remember Richard Nixon in an article, I think in Foreign Affairs many years ago, he said, and he was very prophetic about this. He said, you know, if you don't establish a democracy there from the ground up, not from the top down, but from the ground up, and in Russia, we're going to pay for that later, and that's what's happening now.
Thank you very much.
I wish I could, again, I wish I could give you a better scenario.
Ambassador Sedgwick, Sandy Wilson, thank you both so much. This was absolutely first rate. Thank you.